All right, Alexander, let's talk about the airstrikes on Syria. Lloyd Austin and the Pentagon, they have said that these airstrikes were done in self-defense. And as we reported on the other day, it looks like we are heading towards some sort of wider conflict. And things are getting very, very dangerous and very scary at this moment. Before you talk about these airstrikes, in my video yesterday, I took a clip from Biden's press conference with the Australian Prime Minister Albanese. And Biden said something very interesting when he was asked by reporters about the military hardware and the aircraft carriers that are moving into the region and the possibility of U.S. strikes towards Iran or Syria. And Biden said this, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get his quote exactly right, but he said that he is warning Iran and the Ayatollah. And then he said, this has nothing to do with Israel, or this is not about Israel. That's what Biden said as he was answering these questions from reporters during this press conference. Anyway, I just wanted to say that because I think Biden might have gone a little bit off script there by saying this. But this doesn't have to do with Israel. This is not a deterrent force that is moving into the Mediterranean. And these strikes on Syria, I don't think there's a connection to Israel there either, though the Pentagon said this was in self-defense with the strikes against the U.S. forces that are, we have to say, that are illegally occupying the north of Syria. Anyway, your thoughts on these events?
Yeah. This is all becoming increasingly disturbing and very ominous. And just to say this, there have been American airstrikes in Syria before, as you absolutely correctly say. The United States is not there with the permission of the Syrian government, which is still the internationally recognized Syrian government, and a Syrian government that is now so recognized and readmitted to the Arab League, and which represents Syria at the United Nations. So there is no doubt at all about the legality and legitimacy of the Syrian government, but the United States has troops in eastern Syria without the permission of that government and without authorization from the UN Security Council. So the presence of these troops in Syria is, as you also correctly say, illegal. It is a violation of Syrian sovereignty. So that's the first point to make. The second is that the United States deployed those troops in eastern Syria purportedly in order to fight the various Islamist groups that, ISIS first and foremost. In fact, it was largely justified on the basis of fighting ISIS and other groups like that in Syria. And of course, one can always be cynical about this, but when the United States tended to launch airstrikes in the past, it tended to be directed against those particular groups. The latest airstrikes, the ones that Lloyd Austin was talking about, were not directed at these type of Islamist groups. They were directed at what would appear to be Iranian assets or Iranian-aligned groups within Syria, of which we know there is within which, as we know, Iran has a substantial presence, by the way, in agreement with the Syrian government. So this is an attack on Iranian installations and Iranian-aligned installations in Syria, within Syria. It therefore targets both Syria and ultimately Iran. And that is the nature of the development we are seeing now. And that does appear to lead to a completely new stage of this conflict. Now, Lloyd Austin talks about this being an act of defense. The United States regularly says that. I mean, if you go back to the attack on Iraq, for example, in 2003, that also was described as an attack based upon the doctrine of preemptive defense. I don't think we can take this particularly seriously. What is clearly happening is that there is a very major build-up, and it is increasingly clear that the countries that this build-up is directed against, we've talked about this build-up in recent programs, the aircraft carriers, the military troops that are being deployed on the ground, the surface-to-air missiles that are being deployed, all of this is clearly now focused on Iran. Now, President Biden has blurted out this admission that this is not about the current conflict in Israel. And yesterday, in my program, I discussed an article by Sir Ivor Roberts, who is a former British diplomat, an ambassador, in fact, in the Daily Telegraph. And he spoke about the fact that the concentrations, these movements against Iran, are driven by something in part that is different. And that is concerns that Iran's nuclear program has now developed to the point where Iran is very close to being able to develop nuclear weapons. And that this is what is really driving all of these, this huge build-up. It's all about that. So that ties in exactly with what you were saying about what Biden said over the course of that press conference. It is increasingly looking as if the United States is using the current crisis in the Middle East in order to resolve this problem that the United States has had with Iran in the Middle East since the Islamic Revolution of 1975. They hope once and for all. And what is driving this particularly now, according to people like Sir Ivor Roberts, is concern that the Iranian nuclear program is close to fruition, which would mean, obviously, if it were ever to reach that fruition, that these kind of conventional strikes against Iran would no longer become possible. So that's, I think, where we are.
So what about the JC? I mean, in other words, this is all about weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it seems like where we're heading towards, right? Iran's about to get a nuclear weapon in Iraq. Iraq has chemical, biological weapons, whatever, weapons of mass destruction, anthrax that Colin Powell was holding up at the UN meeting. So here we are again. This is going to be done. This war with Iran is going to be done in order to preempt them from finishing their nuclear weapons. We had the JCPOA.
Yeah, we had the JCPOA, which the Biden administration said it would rejoin, but it never did. And the JCPOA prevented Iran from developing nuclear weapons and created a whole system of having observers, monitors in Iran from the International Atomic Energy Agency. It brought
which they abided by.
Which they abided by, exactly. And, of course, we've also had successive reports from the US intelligence community, which have been unchanged. They go back now more than a decade, which say that Iran is not currently pursuing a nuclear weapons program, that they see no evidence that Iran at the moment is actually working towards developing nuclear weapons. They do have a nuclear enrichment program. In other words, they're building up, they're enriching nuclear materials to the level that would enable them to obtain a stockpile of material that they could use if they wanted to develop nuclear weapons. But as I understand, and I'm not an engineer or a physicist or any of those things, but as I understand, it would still take them quite a long time from reaching that point before they developed an actual nuclear device. It would be not just months, but apparently years. This is what I have been told and understand, whereby you could convert that material into an actual nuclear bomb. And long before that happened, the United States and Israel and the Western countries would be able to pick up evidence of it. So notwithstanding this advice from the US intelligence community, and notwithstanding the fact that there was the available route of the JCPOA, which, as I said, the Biden administration said it would rejoin, but never did. Notwithstanding all of that, we're now told that there are worries about the fact that Iran is coming close to developing a nuclear bomb, and that this is ultimately what is driving all of this. I have to say, I think an even bigger reason, probably the true reason, is that Iran has made some very strong diplomatic moves recently, which have materially improved its position, and which undermine the American sanctions war against that country. Iran recently forged a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. The Chinese brokered it, and that has significantly improved Iran's political position and means that Iran is no longer under the same economic pressures that it was previously. And of course, beyond that, both Saudi Arabia and Iran are due to join the BRICS in January. And of course, as members of the BRICS, and with Iran also joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the likelihood is that the entire sanctions regime against Iran is close to collapse. So, given that that is so, it looks as if there's a huge hurry now to try to resolve the situation with Iran militarily before all of these things happen, and Iran becomes fully integrated in the BRICS, becomes fully part of the new trading system that is being created, becomes fully integrated with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, before Iran starts to acquire sophisticated new weapons from the Russians, Sukhoi 35 fighters, and all of that, making an attack on Iran impossible. So you bring up the issue of what happened in Israel on the 7th of October. You talk up again the alleged threat of nuclear weapons. You talk about bad actors in the Middle East and attacks on American bases, of which there have been some, but not perhaps on any major scale, and certainly none that appear to involve Iran directly. And then you justify that to launch an attack on Iran to prevent all of these diplomatic moves and this reorientation of Iranian policy and the integration of Iran both into the BRICS and Shanghai system and its rapprochement with the Saudis and with the Arab states.
Yeah. Remember Hans Blitz during
Absolutely,
Iraq?
Of course. Yeah.
And he was inspecting the claims that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and he was saying, "Look, I can't find anything," but it didn't stop the Bush White House from launching a war with Iraq. Whatever Hans Blitz, would say didn't stop them, and so, JCPOA and these claims that you're talking about, which is that the JCPOA and all of their results saying that Iran is still far off from. First of all, they're not. It doesn't look like they're creating a nuclear weapon. And if they were, it would take them still a significant amount of time. That's not going to stop the Biden White House from launching a war with Iran. And listening to you, it seems like the real reason for going to war with Iran is because the U.S.'s position in the Middle East is degrading. It's fading, and China and BRICS are presenting a framework of stability to the Middle East that the U.S. never could and never wanted, to be quite honest. Saudi Arabia, Iran, rapprochement. We've talked about how China and Russia now are trying to create some sort of an off-ramp to the conflict in Israel via a framework of a two-state solution, and the coexistence between Israel and the Palestinians. And, they're making a big diplomatic push in that direction. Basically, BRICS is asserting itself in the region.
Yes.
BRICS is providing Iran with the ability to not have the U.S. sanctions
Yes.
weigh down on the country. I mean, Iran can now look to this alternate system, and of course, you have the overall framework of stability in the Middle East, which for China seems to be the ultimate goal, and the U.S. seems like they're like we can't have any of this. And let's not forget about Syria either. Assad was just in Beijing a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
So, I think that's basically what all of this is really about.
It's exactly what it's about. I mean, what is happening, what the United States is confronted with, is that, of course, he thought it could use the sanctions weapon to undermine the government in Syria, and even more so, ultimately, the government in Iran, which it sees the United States has come to see as its principal rival in the Middle East. And, of course, what is now happening is that an alternative trade system is being constructed around the BRICS, which can fully satisfy all of Iran's economic needs, making the sanctions, in effect, completely meaningless and ineffective. So Iran can import technology because, of course, the Chinese and the Russians are equally advanced technologically as the United States is. We saw that with the Huawei chip that we had a few months ago, which, by the way, is a tremendous event in 2023, practically a Sputnik moment, if I can call it that. I mean, this shock revelation that China has the ability to develop chips when the United States has been working overtime to try and China obtaining these chips from Taiwan and South Korea. So Iran can import technology, it can engage in trade, it can develop its own financial system in cooperation with those of the other BRICS states. It is no longer caught up in the spider's web of the US-dominated global financial and trading system that we have known, because that US-dominated global trading and financial system is no longer global any longer. It is having to coexist, or it is looking like it will soon coexist, with this alternative one, which is at least as developed and at least as big, and perhaps, possibly, ultimately, eventually, even more so. So given that that is so, this has to be stopped at all costs, or so people in Washington, the neocons and people like that in Washington think, because it looks as if Iran is going to escape the pressure that they're trying to exert upon it. And so, we have to start moving all these forces to the Middle East. We got a crisis in the Middle East because of what happened in Israel on the 7th of October. We move all of these forces to the Middle East. We talk up these attacks on our bases. And I accept, by the way, that there probably have been some attacks on American bases. But this isn't new. It's happened before. And we're looking to resolve these problems we have with Iran once and for all. That's the thinking. And again, Ivor Roberts talks about, nuclear weapons, distinct from the problem of Hamas and all that.
That's the bait and switch. I mean, it's there's a war in Israel. You have this attack from Hamas. There's going to be a ground invasion in Gaza, and you use all of this to bring your military assets into the region. You tell the American people that this is a force of deterrence, is in order to deter Hezbollah in the north from opening up a second front. And now you use the switch, right? The switch is, these forces are here because Iran is developing WMDs. They're developing a nuke, so we have to stop them. There you have it. And the majority of the American public, I imagine, is going to be on board for this. They're going to say, oh my God, we can't have Iran. What does Hannity call them? Hannity says the mullahs. We can't have the mullahs in Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. Fox News is on board, MSNBC is on board, CNN is on board, and panic is created, and you have your Iraq 2.0. This time it's directed at Iran, a much more difficult country to launch an attack against. But there you have it, the bait is switched, and you have Mike Johnson meeting with Biden, and the Biden White House is trying to figure out a way to get money to Ukraine. And my thinking there is that they're using the Israeli Hamas war in one instance to get all the military assets into position and to use it in the excuse that this is a deterrent force. And I think they want to get the money to Ukraine because while they understand that Ukraine can't win the conflict against Russia, Project Ukraine is over, I imagine they think that this money can keep the Russians occupied, at least until the U.S. does what they're going to do against Iran. I don't know. How do you see all these pieces coming into play right now?
Well, I think the overriding priority is increasingly going to be Iran. I mean, can we say straightforwardly, if the United States is going to get itself involved in a direct confrontation with Iran, which is going to be a difficult country to subdue, and that's putting it mildly. I mean, that is the universal consensus amongst pretty much every single commentator that I have seen. If the United States is going to be drawn into a confrontation with Iran, then whatever ultimately Joe Biden himself might want, it's impossible to see how the commitment to Ukraine is going to be sustained. But they do want to keep the Russians pinned down in Ukraine. They want to use Ukraine as kind of leverage because of the on the Russians to try to sort of distract them and at the same time pressure them so that the United States can focus on Iran. But of course, ultimately, if a war starts with Iran, it will become the absolute overriding, absorbing thing that will dominate US foreign policy. And I'm sorry to say this, I think you're absolutely correct. I think that whereas most Americans are now becoming increasingly disenchanted with the conflict in Ukraine, I think they've never really understood it. They've never really felt engaged in it. They're becoming increasingly distanced from it. They don't like what they see of Zelensky and all of that. With Iran, it's different. There is this unresolved issue for many Americans of what happened all the way back in 1979 when the Iranians stormed the US embassy, took the hostages, kept the hostages, the Americans hostage, the American diplomats hostage for over a year. The US was publicly humiliated at that time. That created a strong sense within the United States that this country is an enemy of the United States, is hostile to the United States, it's also hostile to Israel. And I think that has never dissipated. I think that deep anger that exists towards Iran, which I understand, but I remember the events of the 1979 very well. It has never dissipated, and I'm afraid it has always had the effect of distorting, because I do think it's a misunderstanding of what Iran is about today. It has had the effect of distorting American foreign policy. I think that ever since then, the US, or at least a substantial, dominant body of opinion in the US, has remained implacably hostile to Iran and wants to basically settle accounts with Iran. And they're starting to see the opportunity to do that now.
Yeah, so get some money to Ukraine. Maybe it's not going to be 61 billion. Maybe it'll be 40 billion or 30 billion. Get some money to Ukraine. as you said, try to keep the Russians occupied, distracted, pinned down, try to use it as some sort of leverage over the Russians. Meanwhile, you delay the ground operation in Syria. The New York Times is reporting that Netanyahu is under a great deal of pressure from the Israeli military to start the ground operations, but he is not giving the green light in order to begin the ground operations into Gaza. So you have a war there pending. You have this military operation pending in Gaza. You have Ukraine. You're waiting to get the money to them. Netanyahu is delaying the ground operations, but you have that, over there as well. And it's just a matter of the U.S. giving the green light to Netanyahu. And then you have this big war against Iran. Three different wars, all taking place at once. President Joe Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Austin conducting these 3 wars. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely.
Chaos. It sounds like chaos to me.
Chaos. Absolutely. That is exactly what we're looking at. We're looking at chaos. War. What it's going to do to oil prices, I'm not even going to try to discuss on this program. Chaos in the Middle East, violence spreading across the region, likelihood that we're going to see massive resurgence of all of these very same Islamist groups that we've spent the last 20 years trying to get on top of, because they're going to exploit this vacuum that's going to be created. Probably, quite plausibly, almost certainly, in fact, renewed waves of migrant flows towards Europe, and no clear, discernible outcome. It seems to me that this is so misguided, so wrong, on so many levels. Let me repeat again a point which I have made many, many times. The United States is at the centre of the world trading financial system. More than any other country, it should aim, therefore, for a policy of peace, of stability and peace, sowing the dragon's teeth in every conceivable place, getting American troops, because this is what's going to happen. Remember, Biden talking about the fact that he was an opponent of the forever wars. He's got a war in Ukraine. He's now going to start another war in the Middle East. American soldiers, the US military is having problems recruiting because so many people are not happy to join the military anymore because they become so disenchanted with wars in the Middle East, which never have any successful, viable outcome. And what do? We've got massive conflict with the Russians in Ukraine. We're going to start more conflicts, multiple conflicts, all at the same time in the Middle East. We're going to take on the most powerful, militarily speaking, probably what is the most powerful country in the Middle East, which is Iran. We're going to disrupt the oil situation. We're going to do all of that, and at the same time, we still have massive unresolved issues with China over Taiwan. This is just, it's the opposite way to the way in which a power like the United States should be conducting its foreign policy. I am at a loss for words to express strongly enough how I feel about all of this. And not for the first time, I have to say, but perhaps more so than ever before, I look at these events and I feel, like I'm watching a train hurtling towards the abyss, and there is nothing I can do to stop it. And it is so depressing, so exasperating to see it in that way.
Yeah. Let me ask you one final question. If you want to keep the American soldiers safe that are in Syria, how about you just remove them from Syria?
Yeah, exactly.
There's no. Why are you there? They're illegally occupying Syria. send them back home.
Well, exactly.
Their families.
Which is
what are they doing there?
What are they even doing there? Absolutely. I mean, that, by the way, is an extremely good point.
Stealing the oil.
Yeah. I don't know exactly. Well, it was Donald Trump. Donald Trump wanted to remove them. The Pentagon sabotage. I mean, he just straightforwardly disobeyed his orders, and the officials who did it actually, after Trump ceased to be president, openly bragged about it. They're still there doing what precisely? I mean, nobody seems to know. Nobody's able to say. And those questions are never asked in the United States. And that debate never really happens. It's just assumed that they must be there, even though nobody can really explain to what end and for what purpose. And as I said, the original rationale was to fight ISIS and all those other radical groups, except, of course, that ISIS is supposed to be defeated, except, of course, that what it looks like we're most likely about to do, I say we because, I'm British and the British are also apparently in on all of this, as they always are. Anyway, what we are about to do is going to open the way for those very same Islamist groups that we've been fighting all this time to come back. I mean, it does make one throw up one's hands in despair, but that's where we are.
Real quick, if the U.S. also opens up a front against Syria, so they go after Iran, but they also decide, while we're at it, let's complete the Assad regime change that we started 10, 15 years ago, right? What do you make of Russia's role then? I mean, Putin said in a statement about a week ago, he's got the MiGs with the Kinzhals, 1,000-kilometer range. That's what he was talking about. Don't go against Syria. Russia has a naval base there as well, an air base, sorry, and then the naval air base there in Syria as well. So, what happens if the U.S. says, we're going to go after Iran, but we're also going to attack Syria really hard this time? What's going to be Russia's response?
Who knows? I mean, the one thing I think that the Russians will definitely respond to is if their own people are attacked in Syria. I mean, I think that is all but inevitable. And how do you attack Syria? How do you engineer the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad's government without actually attacking the Russians in Syria? I mean, I don't see how that is possible and how that can be done. So it seems to me that if we do start seeing a military operation to overthrow the Assad government, and this might also be one of the things that's driving this, and it's quite likely that it is. Well, all I can say about that is, first of all, that brings us closer to an outright confrontation between the Russians, a military confrontation between the Russians and the Americans, closer than we have been at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And, if we start attacking Russian air bases and Russian naval bases, and the Russians launched Kinzhal missiles against American carriers, well, I don't even want to consider those possibilities. I hope that it will not come to that, but we are dangerously close to that point, and again, nobody's discussing it.
Okay, the Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfin, and Twitter X, and go to the Duran shop. 20% off. Use the code the Duran 20.